Hello, my name is Mark Anthony Torres, and I'm one of the project managers for the Multi-Institutional Study of Leadership. Now, if you're watching this webinar, you've already participated in the study and have received your school reports. So first, on behalf of the entire MSL team, I want to thank you for your participation in this study. And second, I want to highlight that we are now moving into the final phase of the 2015 study, which entails working with your results. So over the next year, our team is going to engage you in both individualized debriefing and provide you with some additional reports and resources that will help you to drill down even deeper into the data to get as much insight as possible to inform your practice. The MSL intentionally operates on a 3-year cycle to provide campuses with the necessary time to make not only meaning of your data, but also enough time to actually use it to evaluate and enhance your leadership programs so that next time you participate, perhaps in the 2018 cycle, you can begin to see some of that growth. Get into things, I want to quickly pause to make sure we have some helpful documents and information in front of you. As we move through the presentation, these are going to be things that I will reference or direct you to, so it's going to be good to have them readily available. First, make sure you have all 5 of your campus reports in front of you. Although we won't go through each one page by page, we're going to cover the basics of what information is contained within those different reports. You also want to make sure you have something in front of you that you can use to write or type notes and questions as we move through the reports. I can't stress enough how important it is for you to keep track of your questions. They're going to be the primary guide for your campus's debriefing calls, which we'll talk about at the end of this webinar. And finally, you want to make sure that you have your myssg.net site open. Of myssg.net, please make sure you have access to this resource. This is where everything you need is going to be stored. Also, make sure you download everything from that site. Because of hosting limitations, that information will be archived after January 1, 2016. So again, please make sure you download everything. We're actually going to suggest that you save multiple copies in multiple locations to ensure that your campus maintains access to those resources over time. On the site, however, you're going to find, first and foremost, your 5 MSL reports. You're also going to find important background on the social change model. There's an executive summary of the 2015 study, which includes information, again, on the social change model and other scales contained within the study. And this overview is really great to share, especially with administrators who are interested in learning more and better understanding the study. There's also a PowerPoint template that we've created, and it's designed for you to use when you're presenting about your data. There's even template tables within that PowerPoint for you to be able to plug your school's data in for easy presentation. And the 2015 code book is also on the myssg.net site, which is a list of every question in the MSL and information about what questions make up the various scales. This is going to be really helpful for you if you're interested in seeing the exact wording and response options, again, which is particularly useful if you are analyzing your full data set. But it's also helpful just to get a better understanding of what your results mean when you look at what those different questions were. And finally, a copy of your full data set. This is all of the data from your MSL, since not everything can be featured in these 5 reports. It is in SPSS format, so you may require the assistance of institutional research staff or just some colleagues with SPSS experience if you don't have any yourself. Also, if you don't have access to someone who can do this for you and you wish to do more in-depth analysis or additional reports, please reach out to SSG and they can share with you pricing for additional services. With that said, this call is designed to really be a primer for your debriefing call. And if you're anything like I was when I first saw my school's reports, you might be a little intimidated and wondering where to begin. If that's the case, please don't worry. We're going to walk through the basics and help you to better understand how each of these 5 reports work together to provide you and your campus with a lot of valuable data that's really going to help you as you continue in your work to advance college student leadership development. So the goal today is first and foremost to help you understand your report enough so that you and your team can begin to dive into the data and interpret some of those findings and then raise questions about what's going on your campus as it relates to student leadership development. Again, your individualized debriefing call will be a time for more in-depth questions and processing with a member of the MSL team. So today will be a very general overview about how you get started and work through these reports. Okay, so by now you know that each campus has 5 reports, each of which contains a great deal of information for you. The reports are intentionally separated to break information into smaller and more digestible sections. So in a moment, I'm going to briefly walk through each of those reports, but please keep in mind that although there are 5 individual reports, they actually supplement one another and need to be used together to understand what's happening on your campus. So you'll understand a little bit more what that means as we continue through the presentation, but make sure at this time you have all 5 reports ready. Right. The first report is the Study Design and Methodology Report, and this simply introduces the overall MSL reports and provides an overview of the 2015 study, which we are very happy to report includes information from 96 different institutions. If you would like more information regarding, the MSL's theoretical or conceptual framework, survey psychometrics, or a quick overview of our 2015 participating schools, the first report is a really great place to start. I will also say that pages 5 and 6 in the first report are very helpful for those who need a quick refresher on statistics terminology. A quick review of those pages is really going to help you to digest the other reports more easily. Also, for purposes of time, we're not really going to go any further into this report today, but if you do still have questions after you read through it on your own, you can visit the MSL website at leadershipstudy.net or ask a member of the MSL team during your debriefing call. Moving on to report 2, the second report is the respondent characteristics and distributions report. This report contains key information regarding who actually completed the survey at your school and how that compares to the national data set, as well as any other comparison groups that you selected when you registered. Keep in mind that this report only contains data from your random sample respondents. So when you access the tables within the report, you're going to be looking at the characteristics and distributions of those who responded from the random sample. That does not mean information from your entire sample, only the random sample. The information in this report is what you'll use to understand the demographic landscape of your respondents, and then determine if that sample is perhaps representative of your institution. And you can also use this report to explore what academic and co-curricular experiences characterize your respondents. Okay, now that we're getting into the thick of the reports, I want to pause here in the middle of report 2 to share some information on tables. As you can tell, there is a lot of information in your reports, and most of that information is captured in its tables. So when looking at a table, the first thing you want to do is make sure you always check the upper left-hand corner of the table. The bold title above the table is going to tell you the table's title or the general category of data you're looking at. Then, in the uppermost left-hand cell, you'll see the name of the data set you're examining. With the exception of report 4, which we'll get to in a bit, that should almost always contain your institution's name. Now, with that being said, each report contains unique tables that seem similar, but they are actually very different in some significant ways. The biggest piece of advice we can share with you is to make sure you read the table overviews like the one you're looking at right now. The first few pages of every report contains a table map that is tailored to the tables contained within that specific report. So please make sure you read over them so you're aware of how the data are laid out. In particular, as we move through the next reports, you'll begin to see how the different tables across each of the reports can be somewhat confusing. So please make sure that you pay attention to the tables, particularly around, one, are you looking at your school's data or the national data set or a comparison group's data? Two, whether the placement of input, environment, and outcome variables has shifted. Each time you look at a new table, please make sure you clarify what is featured vertically versus what's featured horizontally. So, for example, in one table, social change value outcomes could be compared across your benchmark institutions, but in another table, it may instead look at the relationship between involvement in campus environments and then those social change value outcomes. And finally, make sure you are looking at what the numbers represent. Are you looking at a percentage, a number, a mean score, or a standard deviation? And in particular, if you're looking at a score, make sure you identify the scale it's being measured against. Is it a 4-point scale, a 5, 7, or 8-point scale? Because those will have significant differences in the meaning of the numbers. And again, I know that this may seem like a lot to think about, but please remember that each report will walk you through how to read its tables. And I also want to reiterate, if you got a little anxious when I said words like mean or standard deviation, make sure you review pages 5 and 6 in report 1 on the study design, because it will really help you be able to dig into these tables and understand exactly what those numbers mean. Okay, now back to report 2. First thing I want to do is reiterate that the demographics of your sample are extremely important in understanding your results. As I mentioned, you're going to want to compare your sample demographics with your own institutional data to see if the sample is representative of your campus. And this is important because previous research has shown, that there can be differing scores as it relates to outcomes assessed by the MSL when you're looking across demographic groups. So again, you're going to want to pay attention to the demographic characteristics of your data. I also want to take a second to clarify the difference between response rate and respondent characteristics. So when you're looking at the response rate, you're comparing demographic participation to the overall demographics of the randomly selected students on your campus. However, when you're looking at respondent characteristics, you're looking at percentages that are based on the total number of completed cases from your sample. So that number may, say, only be 2,745. That's the difference that you're going to see when you're looking at the response rate tables versus the respondent characteristics table. Make sure, again, you look at the first few pages of this report to make sure that you understand the difference between those two. Thing I want to mention about report 2 is just a quick note on benchmarks, since this is the first time they're being presented in the reports. When you completed your registration last fall or summer, you were asked to select various comparison groups in that registration process. So any comparative samples that you identified then should be listed as a primary comparison group unless you specifically requested that they not be presented in the reports. Also, if you're a member of one of our 2015 coalitions, then you're going to see that coalition as a benchmark column in your reports as well. And so with that said, we're going to move on to the next report, report 3, but I just want to share that you're going to see moving forward how these benchmark and comparison groups will be used to contextualize your data sample. So now that we're at the third report, which is the general and sub-study outcomes report, you're going to start to see findings about your students' achievement across the general and sub-study outcomes of the MSL. And so this is where you're probably going to want to start to spend a lot more time and focus your attention. The first thing you will see in this report, like I mentioned before, is a guide to reading the tables contained within report 3. So please make sure you review that. But moving to the first actual table presented, you see the primary outcomes of the 2015 study. And those included social change model values, resiliency, leadership efficacy, complex cognitive skills, social perspective taking, and hope. You'll notice that your institution's data is featured in the left-hand column and should be highlighted blue. And then in the columns to the right, you'll see the MSL national sample. And then, like I said earlier, you'll see your comparison group scores. You should also take note that the numerical values presented for each outcome represent either a mean or the standard deviation. And if you pay attention to the scores as you move from the top of the table to the bottom, you're going to see that there are different scales used for each of the outcomes. So again, make sure you consider whether it is a 4, 5, 7, or 8-point scale when you're reading those scores. And finally, I want to circle back to the social change model outcomes for a quick minute to clarify individual value scores versus the omnibus score. The individual values, as you see, provide scores based on their unique 5-point scales. And you will notice that common purpose and change are not listed among the social change model values. Just to quickly clarify, the version of the SRLS that we use here at MSL is unique from the original model and is based on ongoing research and validation efforts that support 6 unique values rather than 8. But moving on to the Omnibus SRLS score, that represents students' overall capacity for socially responsible leadership. So again, if you're interested in looking at the individual values that are captured by the MSL, pay attention to those individual scores. But the Omnibus SRLS score captures that overall capacity for socially responsible leadership. Okay, I want to pause for the cause once again to review some information on statistics. As we said, there is a wealth of information contained in these reports, but you have to understand what you're looking at to really be able to find meaning in the numbers. So the first thing I want to make sure is that we all understand the difference between descriptive data and statistical data. When we're talking about descriptive, it's just the raw numbers. So for example, seniors have higher scores than sophomores on a particular value. But statistical data refers to whether or not those differences are statistically different. That is, whether it's a significant difference that is more than just by chance. Significance is then indicated by a block S appearing in the significance column in your tables. And this significance column is labeled SIG, significance. With that said, in large data sets such as the MSL, oftentimes analyses show statistical significance that might not mean much. So we also then need to look at effect size, which is a statistical formula for whether that significance is actually meaningful. But because we're assessing what's referred to as fuzzy concepts, we want to look at everything with a small effect size or larger. And at the bottom of the tables in the report, you'll see the symbols associated with different effect sizes. So to put it all into practice, and you're looking at this example table, the first thing you want to do is perhaps select an outcome you're interested in examining. So for example, here you might select citizenship. Then what you'll want to do is follow the citizenship row across to first read your school sample's mean score and standard deviation. And then you're going to want to keep following that over to see how the numbers compare to the national data set and your comparison groups in the columns that follow. If you see a block S, for example, in the column associated with the national data set, it means that it is statistically significantly different than the national sample. But again, you then need to look at the effect column right next door to see the effect size. And as you see here, it is a trivial effect. So, and remember, trivial effects are usually meaningless. So we have to be looking for small effect size or greater. Turning to report 3, you're also going to see a table that shares outcomes from the 2015 sub-studies. Every cycle of the MSL, our team selects content areas that are related to leadership research and practice, and we integrate associated scales into the overall MSL instrument. It is important to know that only half of your study participated in either one of the cycle sub-studies, so no one participates in both. And while there is only a brief overview of data from these outcomes in the reports you have here, your full data set contains much more data around these sub-studies. But if you do have additional questions about the sub-study outcomes or even the general outcomes, you should review the information in Report 1 on the study design and then access the MSL 2015 overview document on your myssg.net account, and that explains the outcomes in much more detail. And then we're going to flip to the last table that is covered in this report, which is the delta measure change over time tables. This table can be really confusing for some people, so I want to be very clear and explicit about what these data can and cannot tell you. First, we know from previous research that pre-college experiences matter, as do the experience, obviously, that students have while they are in college. So the delta measure is our way of somewhat controlling for that effect. So what we do is we use a retrospective quasi-pretest, which means it measures changes in how students perceived their capacities prior to college and then at the time of the study. So it's not an actual longitudinal measure, but it is a psychometrically sound measure of how students report that their capacities have changed over time. Second, because the purpose of this measure is to capture the influence of the campus environment on students' capacities, we limit participation to those who have ideally experienced campus the longest, which is seniors. So therefore, the data in this table only represent respondents within your random sample who identified as seniors and beyond. This does not, however, include graduate students. As you can see by looking at the table, you can also use the data here to not only observe patterns of change on your campus, but you can also use it to benchmark your patterns of change with your comparison groups and to see if the patterns mirror each other or are otherwise unique. And the final piece I want to share regarding this table is to please pay attention again to what the numbers are indicating. In particular, make sure you pay attention to whether the changes over time are positive or negative. I will say in some cases there can appear to be an erosion of capacity over time. Most often this does not mean that your institution is making someone less of a leader, but it could demonstrate that individuals perceive their capacity to be greater before entering college and then experience some humbling awareness that their capacity may not have been as great as they originally thought it to be. This can, it's a bit more complicated than we have time to go into depth today, but if it's something that you see in your data, make sure you highlight it and bring it up on your debriefing call so we can dig into it together. All right, so on to the fourth report. It's the Campus Inputs and Environments by Outcomes report. So whereas report 3 shows you how your school's sample scored across the general and sub-study outcomes, report 4 really helps you to begin to tease apart and make meaning of the data in report 3. So to review, by inputs, we mean student demographics and other characteristics. For example, political views and GPA, things like that. And then by environments, we mean student experiences during college. Like, did they live on or off campus? Did they participate in community service or positional leadership? And then again, by outcomes, we are obviously referring to the general and sub-study outcomes of the MSL. More than any other report, you need to pay attention to the table structuring here in report 4. As you'll see, each table hosts a different set of comparison variables and categories that may flip axes from one section of tables to the next. Also pay attention to the scale indicators. Again, a 4.2 out of 5 is much different than a 4.2 out of 8. Big difference in the meaning of those data. And finally, and most noticeably different, significance is indicated by numbers throughout report 4. So, we just reviewed report 3, and in those tables, you would look for the block S and then determine effect size using line and circle symbols in the significance column. But here, that's different. These are the numbers. So if there are no numbers in the columns for a given section, there is no statistical significance. However, if numbers are present, then there is a difference between the categories listed. To determine the direction of the difference, you'll use the mean column, which is labeled with a capital M. In this sample table you see here, you can see that there is a statistically significant difference between traditional and non-traditional age respondents as it relates to the social change model value of consciousness of self. And you can tell that because the numbers are present in the significance column. So by looking at the means and the significance columns together, you see that non-traditional students scored 4.27 out of 5, and traditional students only scored 4.03 out of 5. Therefore, you know that non-traditional age students scored significantly greater than that of traditionally aged students. And that makes sense, given that, research indicates that we become much more aware of ourselves with age and life experience. And the last thing I really want to call attention to, because it used to confuse me, is that the numbers in the significance column are not rank ordering numbers. That they actually refer to the numbers associated with the age category. So if you look, for example, at the traditionally aged student, if you look in the column where it says traditional, there's a 1 right next to it. That is a secondary label for traditional age students. So when you're looking in the significance column, under the non-traditional students, the non-traditional students has a 1 next to in its significance column. That means that it is significantly different than category 1, which is traditional students. So make sure you don't confuse them as rank ordered, because especially when you get into other demographic categories where there are many more options, it can be kind of confusing, and you'll want to think of that as rank ordering, but it's not. It indicates the relationship with the actual category. Again, if you get confused, consult the table guides at the start of the report. I'll also share that the fourth report is broken into two major sections. The first section examines inputs by outcome measures, meaning that it'll show differences in the general study outcomes by student characteristics and demographics. Then in the second section, it's looking at the environments by outcome measures, showing differences in general outcomes based on college experiences. You will notice that I put an asterisk by the environments by outcome measures section because this section tends to be really helpful when we're examining the influence our programs have on student leadership development. But make sure you pay attention to significance here and the direction of the numbers. You know, the idea is if you see participation in an experience is associated with higher scores, then you want to try to do more of that. If an experience does not show a difference or the difference goes in a negative direction, then consider what the content of that program is and why that difference or that negative difference is there. And you may also want to go back to report 2 when looking at this section to look at the respondent characteristic tables to see how many and which students responded to these questions if the results aren't what you expected. Again, report 4 is very, very helpful here, but make sure if there are pieces that you're confused by or things that seem out of the ordinary of what you are expecting, that you highlight those for your debriefing call. And one final note in this fourth report, as you can understand, it becomes very, very difficult to read expansive tables. So there are actually two sets of tables in each section. So in the first section, you will have two sets of input by outcome tables. And then in the second section, you have two sets of environments by outcome tables. This is done just to keep the table smaller and easier to read. So the first set of tables in each of the sections will look at the core social change model and resiliency outcomes. And then the second set of tables within each section will then list the other general outcomes as you see here on the screen, like hope and things like that. Last and certainly not least is the fifth report, which is the National Inputs and Environments by Outcomes report. And if you notice, this slide looks identical, nearly identical to the slide before it, because the fifth report is pretty much identical to the fourth, with the exception that it only features the national data set. So many people actually reference this report to look at trends at the national level, both as it relates to student characteristics and what's working with regard to campus programs and other college experiences. Again, it's another good tool to use if you're looking to contextualize your data. All right, at this point, we have now finished working our way through your 5 reports. I know that was a lot of information, and you may want to go back and revisit each of those. Again, additional information at the start of every one of those reports that you've printed out. But as a reminder, it is critical that you access and download your full data set from your MySSG account. While the 5 reports here are fairly comprehensive in nature, they do not contain every item from the MSL instrument. And again, they only contain data from the random sample. Your full data file, however, also contains the qualitative write-in responses from your students, as well as the data collected from any of your custom questions that your institution submitted during the registration and enrollment process. With that said, if you would like additional reports generated for you, but you don't have resources on your campus to run those analyses, you can always contact SSG about the different services and pricing options they have. They've been very helpful to many of our partner campuses in the past. So when thinking about next steps, now that you know how to read your reports, our best advice is just to spend some quality time with them, either individually or with a team of your colleagues. And we say this because it'll allow you to get a better handle on what your data set is telling you about leadership development on your campus. For me, I always suggest that just start by combing through the report and circling things that stand out either as interesting or otherwise compelling for you in your office. and share those things with your students and your staff, your colleagues. Discuss what they might mean for your work together. I also recommend please ask questions. Write them right in the report. Write them, in a separate document. But bring those to your debriefing calls, because the most effective debriefing calls are the ones that are guided by your questions that were generated by actually working through the data in advance of the call. And finally, we will send you a very short debriefing call survey along with information to schedule your call in the coming weeks. And so the reason we do this is because the survey contains several questions that, again, are going to have you reflect on your data set and help us figure out what you're looking for additional support on in advance of your debriefing call. It really will make that call as efficient and helpful for you as possible, because it'll allow us to do some of our own homework prior to getting on that call so we can better assist you. Speaking of the debriefing call, just a couple of quick reminders about that. In general, the debriefing call is going to be where a member of the MSL team meets with you over the phone for 1 hour to answer questions and just discuss your results in greater depth. And those calls are going to begin the week of July 20th and wrap up by October 1st. So please be on the lookout for a scheduling email from our team in the coming week. That will be really important that you get that done, specifically because of scheduling. So we will send out a schedule of availability, and it's first come, first serve. So make sure that you complete that pre-call survey and look through your reports before the call, because it's going to make that call, like I said, much more useful. And make sure you sign up for your debriefing call as soon as possible so that you have the time slot that is going to work for your team. And speaking of, we encourage you actually to have other members of your team on the call, but we know that scheduling can be difficult. So obviously, if it's an individual on the other end of the line, that absolutely works. But we find these calls are much more useful and engaging when there are multiple members of your team or different staff from around your campus who could use this information on the call. And now that you've participated in the 2015 study and received your data, you'll want to be as connected to the MSL team and your fellow participating schools as possible. So we really recommend that you get connected. The first, just as a point of information, you will automatically be added to a listserv with the other 2015 schools so that you all can share questions, strategies for using your data, and enhancing your programs, be in conversation with one another as you go through this process. Second, you can join us on social media via our Facebook group. We have a Twitter handle and also a YouTube account, as you see on the screen. And like as many will attest, you'll find that the MSL community continues to grow with each new cycle, and being connected to educators, really around the world is a tremendous resource for you and your work and your campus, really. So we really encourage you to make use of the listserv, join us on social media, and start communicating with other participating schools. And as we mentioned, an email will be coming out to you soon from a member of our team. But if you have questions in the immediate future, please feel free to visit our website, which is stock full of information on the study, but also don't hesitate to reach out. As you see, the mslconnection@gmail.com is our primary email account, so please utilize that if you do have questions prior to your debriefing call. And finally, if you have any issues specifically accessing your My SSG account, or if you're interested, again, in additional reporting services, then use the support@surveysciences.com email address there to go ahead and contact SSG regarding those matters. And last thing I will say is thank you again for your participation in the 2015 study. Best of luck to you from the entire MSL team as you begin working through your reports. I know this is an overwhelming piece of the process, but it is also an incredibly exciting piece of the process. And we really look forward to speaking with many of you in the coming months as we engage in these debriefing calls and start to put some of the data to use on your campuses.